It was Halloween night in 2017, and I was driving back from a small costume party at a friend's house. The roads were almost empty, except for the occasional groups of kids walking home with pillowcases full of candy. The town I lived in was small, surrounded by long stretches of dark woods and abandoned farmland. Once you left the center of town, there weren't many streetlights, just black trees, the faint glow of the moon, and the sound of your own tires rolling against the pavement. I was 22 at the time, living alone in a small rented house near the edge of town. It was around midnight when I decided to head back, which was probably a mistake because I'd already been drinking a little at the party. Not enough to be drunk, but enough that I was hyper-aware while driving. My nerves were on edge, and when the roads got darker, every shadow felt alive. At one point, I slowed my car because I thought I saw something move at the tree line. My headlights cut across the woods, and for a split second, I swear I saw a man standing between the trees. He was wearing something on his head, round, orange, almost glowing. A pumpkin mask. At first, I laughed nervously to myself. It was Halloween night, after all, probably just some kid trying to creep people out. But what bothered me was the way he stood there, perfectly still, half hidden in the shadows, facing the road, not moving, not even reacting when the headlights hit him. I drove on, shaking it off. But a few minutes later, I saw him again. This time, standing on the opposite side of the road, closer now, almost like he had somehow moved ahead of me, still not moving, just standing there, with that pumpkin mask tilted slightly to the side. My chest tightened. I pressed down harder on the gas. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop glancing in my mirrors, half expecting him to suddenly be behind me. When I finally reached my street, I felt a huge wave of relief. My house sat at the very end, near the woods, with no neighbors close by. I pulled into my driveway, grabbed my things, and rushed inside. I made the mistake of looking back before shutting the door. At the very edge of the road, just barely lit by the streetlight, stood the man in the pumpkin mask. My blood ran cold. I locked the door instantly, pulling the curtains shut, trying to convince myself it wasn't real. Maybe my mind was exaggerating. Maybe it was just a teenager pulling a prank. But the thing was, how did he keep getting ahead of me on the road? That night, I tried to sleep, but every sound outside made me jump. Around 3 a.m., I heard it. A slow, deliberate knocking on my front door. I froze. The knocks weren't random. They were 3 slow, heavy thuds. Then silence. I didn't dare move. My phone was in my room, but I couldn't bring myself to cross the dark hallway to get it. The knocking came again, louder this time. Finally, I built up the courage to crawl to my room, shut the door, and grab my phone. My hands were shaking as I dialed 911. I whispered into the receiver, telling the dispatcher that someone was outside my house. They told me to stay on the line, that an officer was being sent. While I waited, the knocking turned into scratching, long, slow scratches that dragged across the wood of my door. Then silence again. When the police finally arrived, the sound had stopped. I heard the officer outside shouting, walking around the property. A few minutes later, he knocked on my window, telling me it was safe. When I opened the door, he said there was no one around, but his expression was uneasy. He told me something that still chills me to this day. About 10 feet from my front door, on the ground, they had found a freshly carved pumpkin. The inside was hollowed out, the face carved into a wide, jagged grin, but there was something else stuffed inside. A Polaroid photograph. It was a picture of me, taken from outside my own house, through the window. The officer took it as evidence. but nothing ever came of it. They never caught whoever did it. And every Halloween since, I make sure to leave town before midnight, because no matter how many years pass, I can't shake the feeling that the man in the pumpkin mask is still out there, watching, waiting. In 2020, I rented a small basement apartment in an old house just outside the city. The rent was cheap, too cheap for the area, but the landlord told me nobody stayed long because the place felt strange. I brushed it off as superstitious nonsense. On Halloween night, I decided to stay in, order some takeout, and binge horror movies. Around 11:45, while I was microwaving leftovers, the power went out. The apartment went completely dark. I grabbed my phone flashlight and walked down the hallway toward the breaker panel. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach flip. At the very end of the hallway was a door. But here's the thing, there had never been a door there before. I had lived in that apartment for 3 months, and the hallway had always just ended with a blank wall. Now, a tall, narrow wooden door stood in its place. Its paint was peeling, and the handle looked old, rusted. My heart was hammering, but something about it pulled at me, like it was daring me to open it. I told myself it was a trick of the dark, maybe just my imagination. But when I touched the handle, it was ice cold, real and solid. I pulled it open. Beyond was a staircase leading down into pitch black darkness. The smell that drifted up was damp, earthy, like rotting soil. I should have called the landlord. I should have slammed it shut, but instead, like an idiot, I grabbed a candle and started descending. The steps creaked under my weight, and with every step, the air grew colder. At the bottom, I found myself in a narrow tunnel. The walls weren't made of brick or concrete, they were dirt, like someone had dug this passage out by hand. As I walked further, I saw faint carvings scratched into the dirt walls. Faces, hundreds of them, twisted, screaming faces etched crudely with fingernails. Then I heard it. Footsteps behind me. I spun around, holding up the candle. Nobody was there. But when I turned back, the tunnel stretched longer than before, like it was growing. The candle flickered violently. From the darkness ahead, I saw movement, something crawling on all fours, fast, its limbs too long for its body. I dropped the candle and bolted back toward the stairs. My hands clawed at the steps, pulling myself up as fast as I could. When I finally slammed the door shut behind me, the power in my apartment flickered back on. The hallway was empty. The door was gone. I told myself I imagined the whole thing, but 2 nights later, when I came home from work, there was dirt on my carpet, fresh dirt leading from the hallway to the side of my bed. And carved into the wood of my nightstand was a single sentence: "You opened it. Now it knows where you sleep." Back in 2013, I worked as a babysitter to earn some extra money while attending community college. Most of the jobs were easy: watch a kid, give them dinner, and put them to bed. But one Halloween night, I got a call from a family I had never babysat for before. The mother, a woman named Claire, sounded frantic. She said their usual sitter had canceled last minute, and she desperately needed someone to watch her daughter while she and her husband went to a costume party. They lived on the outskirts of town, in one of those old Victorian houses that had been restored to look charming in daylight, but at night, the place looked straight out of a ghost story. When I got there, Claire introduced me to her daughter, Emily. She was around 7 years old, wearing a little witch costume with a crooked hat. She seemed polite, but strangely quiet. Her wide brown eyes lingered on me a little too long whenever I spoke. Before leaving, Claire bent down and whispered something to Emily, something I couldn't quite hear. Emily just nodded. The night started off normal. I made Emily a grilled cheese sandwich, then we watched a Halloween cartoon on TV. Around 9 p.m., I told her it was time for bed. She didn't argue, just walked upstairs silently and got into bed without a word. I sat in the living room, scrolling on my phone. That's when I heard it, a faint giggle. At first I thought Emily had gotten out of bed, but when I checked upstairs, she was lying perfectly still under the covers, pretending to sleep. I went back down, a little unsettled. Not even 10 minutes later, I heard the giggle again, this time coming from the kitchen. When I went in to check, the lights flickered, and in the faint reflection of the window, I could swear I saw a small figure standing behind me. But when I turned, no one was there. Trying to calm myself, I went back to the couch. That's when Emily's voice drifted down the stairs. But it wasn't playful, it was a whisper. "Don't let her in." I froze. "Emily," I called out. Silence. I crept back upstairs, my heart pounding. Emily was still in bed, but her eyes were wide open now, staring at the window across the room. When I looked, my stomach dropped. There was another child standing outside, a little girl, same size as Emily, wearing the exact same witch costume. Her face was pale, her eyes dark, and she was smiling. She raised her hand and tapped on the glass. "Let me in," she whispered. I staggered back. Emily suddenly sat up in bed, grabbing my wrist with surprising strength. "That's not me," she whispered urgently. "Don't open the window." I didn't sleep a second that night. I stayed in the hallway, clutching my phone, too terrified to move. When Claire and her husband came home hours later, the figure outside was gone. I tried to explain what happened, but Claire just gave me a tired, knowing look. Before I left, she pulled me aside and said something I'll never forget. "You did the right thing. Last year, our sitter wasn't so careful. She let the other Emily inside. We never saw her again." When I was in high school, me and 3 friends had a dumb Halloween tradition. We'd pick the creepiest place in town and dare each other to stay there until midnight. In 2015, the spot we chose was an abandoned drive-in theater on the edge of town. It had been closed for decades, but the giant screen was still standing, cracked, weather-beaten, with graffiti covering the bottom. The rows where people used to park were overgrown with weeds. Rumor was a man had died there in the 80s, found in his car after some late-night screening. Nobody knew if it was suicide or something worse. That night, it was me, Ryan, Melissa, and Jonah. We hopped the broken fence just before 11 p.m. The air was freezing, and the place was so quiet you could hear every rustle in the weeds. Melissa joked that it felt like we were being watched, and Jonah laughed a little too loudly, trying to act tough. We set up near the middle row, right where the old speaker poles still stuck out of the ground. Sitting there in the dark, surrounded by nothing but black trees and the looming white screen, felt way scarier than I had expected. Then, at 11:30, the screen flickered. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but no, a faint light spread across the surface, like an old projector had suddenly come alive. The picture was grainy, black and white. A man was sitting in a car, smoking a cigarette. He wasn't an actor I recognized, and it wasn't any old movie I'd seen before. Jonah whispered, "What the hell is this? There's no power here." The 4 of us just sat frozen, staring. The man on the screen slowly turned his head, and it felt like he was looking straight at us. Then, the camera angle changed. Suddenly, the screen showed a wide shot of the drive-in itself, not from years ago, but as it looked right now. We could see ourselves, sitting there in the middle row, huddled together. Melissa gasped, "That's us!" We scrambled to our feet, panicking. Ryan shouted that it was some prank, but there was no projector, no booth, no light source anywhere. Just the screen glowing on its own. The image zoomed in closer, showing the four of us standing in the exact spot we were in. Only, something was wrong. There was a fifth figure, a tall man in a dark coat, standing right behind us. I spun around so fast I nearly tripped. No one was there. But on the screen, the man was still behind us, closer now, reaching out. Jonah bolted first, climbing the fence like his life depended on it. The rest of us followed, not even looking back. We didn't stop running until we were back in Ryan's car, speeding down the road. When I finally dared to look over my shoulder, the screen was still glowing faintly in the distance. But the thing that keeps me up even now, 10 years later, is this. 2 weeks after that night, Jonah went missing. His car was found abandoned near the drive-in, and when the police searched the place, they found something scratched into the base of the screen, deep enough to tear through the wood. It was one sentence. "Now the reel is complete."
In 2019, I was driving cross-country to visit my brother. The trip was long, and by the time I reached rural Indiana on October 31st, I was too tired to keep going. I pulled off the highway and found a small roadside motel, the kind with a neon sign buzzing half dead and a row of identical doors lined up under flickering yellow lights. The man at the front desk barely spoke. He slid me a key to room 6 without making eye contact. The place felt strange right away, but exhaustion pushed me past the unease. All I wanted was a bed. The room was nothing special. Faded carpet, a stained chair, a TV that looked 20 years old. But the moment I closed the door, I noticed something odd. The mirror on the wall wasn't centered. It was tilted slightly downward, as if it had been rehung in a hurry. I didn't think much of it at first. I dropped my bag, turned on the TV for background noise, and collapsed onto the bed. I must have dozed off, because when I woke up, it was past midnight. The TV was off, even though I'd left it on. The air felt heavier, the room colder. That's when I heard it. A faint scratching sound coming from the mirror. I sat up slowly, staring at it. The sound grew louder, like fingernails dragging along glass. My skin prickled. I forced myself to get up and step closer. For a second, all I saw was my own reflection, pale and tired. But then, behind me, something moved. I spun around. The room was empty. When I looked back at the mirror, my reflection didn't match. I was standing still, but the me in the glass tilted its head slowly to the side, smiling in a way I wasn't. I stumbled back, heart racing. My reflection raised its hand and pressed its palm against the glass. I swear I could see the surface of the mirror ripple like water. Suddenly, there was a knock on the door, loud, 3 heavy bangs that echoed through the room. I froze, staring between the mirror and the door. Whoever was knocking didn't call out, didn't say a word, just knock, pause, knock, pause, knock. I worked up the courage to ask, "Who is it?" My voice cracked. No answer. I edged toward the door, every instinct telling me not to open it. But before I could decide, I heard a whisper, faint but clear, coming from the mirror behind me. "Don't let him in." My blood went cold. I turned back. My reflection was gone. The mirror was empty, just a blank sheet of dark glass. The knocking stopped. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. As soon as the sun rose, I grabbed my bag and left. The front desk clerk watched me with a strange expression as I checked out, like he already knew what I had experienced. On my way out, I glanced at the motel sign again. The neon buzzed weakly, the vacancy part flickering in and out. And underneath the sign, almost hidden in the weeds, was a faded wooden board with painted letters that made my stomach twist. It read, "Room 6, closed. Do not rent." But the clerk had given me the key anyway. I never saw my reflection smile at me again, but I avoid motels on Halloween, especially ones with crooked mirrors, because I know now, sometimes what you see in the glass isn't you at all.
Halloween night shifts are always strange. Whether you work at a gas station, a diner, or even an office, there's something about the hours after midnight on October 31st that feels different. But the scariest shift I ever had, the one that still makes me feel uneasy whenever Halloween comes around, happened when I was working at a hospital in 2014. I was 23 at the time, a nursing assistant at a mid-sized hospital just outside of Philadelphia. Back then, I usually worked day shifts, but every now and then they'd put me on nights. I didn't really mind because night shifts were quieter. Fewer visitors, fewer bosses breathing down your neck. But Halloween night felt different from the moment I clocked in. The halls were dimmer than usual, not because the lights were off, but because the staff had draped cheap orange and black decorations over some of them. Plastic pumpkins sat on the front desk, and a string of fake cobwebs hung above the entrance. To most people, it probably looked festive. To me, it felt like a bad attempt to disguise the fact that hospitals are already unsettling places at night. My shift started at 11 p.m. I was stationed on the 4th floor, which was a mix of recovery rooms and long-term care. Most of my job that night was checking vitals, making rounds, and responding to call lights. By midnight, things had quieted down, and I started to feel the heaviness of the hour. That strange combination of fatigue and alertness you only get when you're awake at times you shouldn't be. Around 12:30, the call light from room 417 started blinking. That room was assigned to Mr. Jacobs, a man in his 70s recovering from a hip replacement. He was one of those patients who complained constantly, but harmlessly. I sighed, grabbed my chart, and walked down the hallway. The lights buzzed faintly above me, and I could hear the squeak of my sneakers against the linoleum echo in the empty corridor. When I pushed the door open, the room was dark. Only the dim glow from the monitor beside his bed lit the space. But when I stepped closer, I froze. The bed was empty, sheets neatly folded, untouched. That didn't make sense. I had seen him only an hour before, asleep, and it wasn't like he could have gotten far, not with his condition. "Mr. Jacobs," I called softly, thinking maybe he had gone to the bathroom on his own. The bathroom door was ajar, light spilling from inside, but when I peeked in, it was empty. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach clench. The call button, the one patients pressed to alert nurses, was lying on the bed. Someone had pressed it, someone who was no longer in the room. I stepped back out into the hallway and looked around. Nothing but silence. The floor felt empty, too empty. I checked the nurses' station, asked my coworker Tina if she'd seen Jacobs walk out. She shook her head. "No way," she said. "That man can barely stand." But when we both went back to his room, the monitor was still on, still showing his name and information. The only difference was the faint sound of something dripping in the bathroom. Tina frowned, pushed the bathroom door wider and gasped. Inside, written across the mirror in something dark and smudged, were the words, "It's Halloween." It didn't look like blood. It was too faint, too watery, but the fact that it was written there at all made my chest tighten. Tina immediately left to get security, while I stood frozen, staring at the words. That's when I heard something down the hall. A shuffle, like slow footsteps dragging along the floor. I stepped into the hallway, and at the far end, near the fire exit, I saw what looked like a figure. It was hunched, its movements uneven, like it was limping. For a second I thought it was Mr. Jacobs, but the proportions seemed off. The figure was too tall, its limbs too long, its head tilted in an unnatural way. "Sir?" I called, my voice trembling. The figure stopped, and even though the hall was poorly lit, I swear I saw it turn its head toward me. Not fully, just enough to make me feel like it was acknowledging me. Then, without warning, it bolted. The fire exit door slammed open, echoing through the hall, then silence. By the time security arrived, there was no one. They searched the stairwell, the entire floor, but found nothing. And Mr. Jacobs? He was back in his bed, sleeping, breathing steadily as if nothing had happened. The words on the mirror were gone, too. Tina and I looked at each other, both of us pale. Security acted like we were imagining things, but we both knew what we saw. And the strangest part? The next morning when I checked Jacob's chart, there was a note from the surgeon. It said Jacob's procedure had been postponed due to complications. He hadn't been admitted yet. Room 417 had been empty the whole night. To this day, I avoid hospitals on Halloween because I don't know what I saw that night or who pressed that call button, but I know this. Whatever it wasn't human.
I used to work the overnight shift at a small gas station off Route 9 in New Jersey. It wasn't a glamorous job, but it paid my bills, and honestly, I liked the quiet. Most nights were uneventful. A few truckers fueling up, the occasional drunk driver grabbing snacks, nothing more. But one Halloween night in 2017, something happened that still keeps me up whenever I think about it. The night had started normally. The station was decorated half-heartedly, a cheap skeleton taped to the door, plastic pumpkins on the counter. It was almost funny how out of place the decorations looked under the buzzing fluorescent lights. Around 11:45 p.m., business had slowed down. I was leaning back in the chair behind the register, scrolling on my phone, when the bell above the door jingled. I looked up and saw a man walk in. He was tall, wearing a dirty gray hoodie pulled over his head, his face shadowed. He didn't say anything, just walked slowly toward the back of the store where the coolers were. Something about him made me uneasy immediately. His movements were too slow, deliberate, like he was trying too hard not to draw attention, which ironically did the opposite. After a few seconds, I heard the cooler door open, then close, but the man never came back to the counter. I craned my neck, trying to see down the aisle, but the angle of the security mirror didn't catch him. "Sir," I called out. No response. I stood up, walked around the counter, and made my way to the back. The cooler door was closed, but when I opened it, the man wasn't there. Nobody was there. Confused, I circled the aisles. Empty. The bathroom door was shut, so I knocked. No answer. I unlocked it with the staff key. Empty. At this point, I started to think maybe I was losing it. But when I returned to the counter, my stomach dropped. Sitting on top of the register was a black plastic bag I hadn't seen before. I carefully opened it. Inside were several old, faded photographs.
At first, they looked random, blurry shots of highways, buildings, empty fields. But then I noticed something that made my chest tighten. In one of the photos, I saw the gas station. This gas station. Same faded red roof, same flickering sign. Only the picture looked decades old, like it had been taken in the 80s. The next photo was of the inside of the store. I recognized the counter, the aisles, even the crooked sale sign above the chips. But in the picture, the aisles weren't empty. There was a figure standing where I had just been, tall, wearing a gray hoodie, his head tilted down so his face was in shadow. My blood ran cold. Before I could even process it, the bell above the door jingled again. I snapped my head up. The man in the gray hoodie was back, standing in the doorway, staring at me. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then slowly, he raised one hand and pointed directly at me. I froze, gripping the edge of the counter so hard my knuckles went white. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just kept pointing. Then the lights in the store flickered violently, buzzing like they were about to blow out. And when they steadied, the man in the gray hoodie was gone. The door never opened. The bell never rang. I grabbed the photos and stuffed them back into the bag, heart racing. I wanted to run outside to see if he was in the lot, but I couldn't make myself move. I just sat there until dawn, staring at the door, too afraid to blink. When my manager came in that morning, I told him everything. He looked skeptical, but when I showed him the black bag with the photos, his face turned pale. "Where'd you get these?" he asked quietly. I told him. He shook his head. No, this isn't possible." He then explained that years ago, long before I worked there, a man had been found dead behind the gas station. He was wearing a gray hoodie. His body was discovered by the morning clerk on Halloween night. Nobody ever found out what happened to him. My manager took the bag and said he'd deal with it. I quit the job a week later. And to this day, whenever I drive past Route 9 on Halloween, I can't bring myself to look at that gas station, because I know, if I do, I might see a man in a gray hoodie standing by the door, pointing right at me.
Back in college, I worked part-time at the campus library. It wasn't a bad job, quiet, simple, and it gave me plenty of time to study. Most of the time, the scariest thing about that place was how silent it got after dark. But one Halloween night during my junior year, I discovered there were worse things to fear than silence. The library closed at 10 p.m., but I was assigned to stay late that night to help with inventory in the basement archives. That part of the library was off-limits to students. It was where they kept old records, newspapers, and boxes of documents that barely anyone touched. The basement always gave me a weird vibe. The air was colder down there, heavy with a musty smell that reminded me of damp paper and dust. The lights buzzed faintly, and shadows clung to the corners no matter how many bulbs were on. It was around 11:30 p.m. when I realized I was the only one left. The head librarian had left earlier, telling me to lock up when I finished. I wasn't worried at first. I just wanted to get the job done quickly so I could go home. The archives were organized into rows of metal shelves stacked with boxes. I wheeled a cart into one of the aisles and started checking barcodes. That's when I noticed something odd. One of the boxes had been pulled slightly off the shelf, like someone had started to take it down but changed their mind. I slid it back into place, but as I did, I noticed faint writing on the side of the cardboard. It wasn't a label. It was a sentence scrawled in shaky handwriting. "Don't stay past midnight." I frowned, brushing it off as some prank from years ago. But when I looked at the next box on the shelf, I froze. It had the same warning, written in the same shaky script. My stomach tightened. I glanced at my phone. The time was 11:59. I told myself it was nothing, just graffiti from years ago.
But as the clock ticked closer to midnight, the silence in the basement grew heavier, almost oppressive. I started to feel like someone was watching me from between the shelves. At exactly 12:01, the lights flickered. Once, twice, then steadied. I took a deep breath and went back to my work, forcing myself not to panic. But then I heard it. A faint sound like paper crumpling, coming from the far end of the aisle. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. No answer. I pushed the cart slowly down the aisle, my footsteps echoing on the concrete floor. The sound of crumpling paper grew louder, and when I turned the corner at the end of the shelves, my breath caught in my throat. There was a man crouched on the floor. His clothes were old-fashioned, like something from the 1950s, a button-up shirt, suspenders, slacks. He was holding a stack of yellowed papers, crushing them in his hands and dropping them to the floor one by one. "Sir?" I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He lifted his head slowly, and that's when I realized something was terribly wrong. His face was pale, almost gray, and his eyes were completely black. No whites, no pupils, just black voids staring at me. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. The man stood up, the papers falling from his hands. He didn't move toward me, but his mouth opened. Wide, too wide. His jaw seemed to stretch unnaturally as he let out a sound I can only describe as a mix between a scream and the tearing of paper. I bolted. I shoved the cart aside and sprinted toward the stairs. Behind me, I could hear the echo of footsteps, heavy, fast, chasing me. I didn't dare look back. When I reached the stairwell, I slammed the door shut and locked it. The sound stopped instantly. Silence returned, broken only by the pounding of my own heartbeat in my ears. I didn't waste time. I grabbed my bag and ran out of the library without looking back. The next day, I tried to tell the head librarian what happened. She looked at me strangely and said, "You didn't go into the basement, did you?" When I asked why, she explained that decades ago, a student had gone missing down there on Halloween night. They never found him, just his belongings scattered among the archive shelves. Since then, staff reported strange things, missing boxes, odd noises, shadows that didn't belong. I never worked another late shift at that library again. And even now, whenever I smell old paper, I think of that man with the black eyes crushing documents into dust, waiting for someone foolish enough to stay past midnight. Which story scared you the most? Comment below and subscribe for more true horror stories.